That's the music of the David Sanford Big Band on Greenleaf Music, and I'll be talking to David Sanford today in this episode. Really great big band, and we talk about all kinds of music, composition ideas, of course. We both started on trombone, and we talk about all kinds of things. We talk about Hugh Reagan, and we listen to a bunch of his music. So I hope you enjoy this episode. As always, please come and visit us, greenleafmusic.com, where you can get all of these episodes and the entire catalog of music by subscribing. It's a great collection of all sorts of artists and music, and a lot of my music. And it's our pleasure to keep that going. So please come join us, greenleafmusic.com. And here is the episode with David Sanford. David Sanford, so great to talk to you. Thanks for making the time. We were hearing your piece, Pop It, and it's just an honor to get to talk to you and to have released this record at Greenleaf Music.
Oh, honor is all mine. Thank you very much for having me on the label and here.
You're very welcome. I was poking around a little bit, and I realized we're both born the same year, and we both started on the same instrument. But we took different paths. Your bio anyway says that you were really fascinated by big bands right from the beginning, and I'm wondering if that's related to Pittsburgh, because I know that the connection to Pittsburgh is important for you.
I wish it was. I started on trombone in Pittsburgh, but I didn't really take to it. My brother started on, it's a circuitous path how I got to trombone. I actually started on trumpet, believe it or not, and I couldn't get a note out of it. So that lasted about 2 weeks. And then they moved me to euphonium. And
exactly the reverse for me.
Oh, right. Okay.
Started on trombone and switched to trumpet. Yeah. So you went to euphonium?
Right, and then the middle valve stuck, and so they had to send it off somewhere to get it fixed. In the meantime, they gave me a trombone, so I ended up playing the same instrument as my brother, which, of course, is the worst. I mean, we're 2 years apart, but, we end up competing and everything, so that was just another thing that sort of became an issue between the two of us, and, he'd started on it, so, but yeah, after moving to Colorado was really, we had a outstanding junior high band director named William McMosley, who just passed away recently. And my brother was in junior high at that time. I was still in grade school, and he said, "I'll come and check out our big band rehearsing." And I knew very little about big bands, and it was one of those things where the minute I heard them, I was just in awe. I just loved it. I mean, I wanted to, I couldn't believe, for one thing, the trombones got to play something so cool. I don't think I'd ever heard saxes up close like that. And I'd never seen improvised solos and knew that that's what they were doing. So it was, one of those moments where you can just say, wow, my life has changed.
Did you feel like, as a trombonist, being in the middle of that maelstrom of big band arranging was part of what led you to composition?
Definitely, yeah. I think my earliest interest in wanting to do something, that director left after my 7th grade year. In 8th grade, somehow, I don't know why our library became completely barren, but there was just nothing there. And I remember thinking, boy, it'd be really cool if we could do the Bob Newhart theme, the Pat Williams, like a junior high band playing this, of course. Now I'm laughing about it, but so I thought, hey, I could take this, and I mean, but long before I had a tape of it, I'm just trying to do it from memory and write it out. And I had no idea what else happened in that piece other than the minute and a half that you get, on the actual television broadcast. And I tried writing that out, and I have no idea what it sounds like. I mean, my director copied it out from the score, and I think we looked at it one day, and obviously couldn't get past bar one, so that was. But yeah, I think I immediately kind of wanted to be part of that. And then, of course, the more music I actually heard in that genre, I can remember Woody Herman's Jim Pugh's version of Crosswinds. And we knew Crosswinds from Billy Cobham, but, his has this whole fugal thing in the middle. And I thought that was just an absolute gas. Of course, everything Maynard Ferguson did was wonderful. Those early bands you first hear, I think all of those, and just even high school and junior high bands that you hear at jazz festivals, you just went, oh, wow, that drummer was funky as heck, and so forth. So yeah, it was life changing.
And do you still play trombone?
Since I had kids, I don't have the time that I used to. I teach at Mount Holyoke College, and they have a big band which very often does not fill out the low brass section. So I will sit in on bass trombone, and there was a long period where I didn't play at all between really 85 to 2000 or so, and then it took me forever to get my lip back then. Now it's not great, but I never had great chops to begin with. So yeah, when I have a chance, I mean, I played with the orchestra there, or I'll play with the big band there. But it's few and far in between. And I don't know, maybe once, either when I'm retired or when the kids are moved on to college, I might try and get back to it if I still have anything to offer.
Long tones,
right? Carmine Caruso, right?
Hey, well, yeah, sure. That's a whole other thing. But so do you feel like your main thing as a performer then is being a conductor at this point, and since that time?
As a performer, yes. I performing is, I mean, I'm kind of one of those people that loves watching other people do it. And, I air instrument probably as much, if not more, than almost anybody I know. But I don't love seeing my face in front of an audience. I sure as heck don't like hearing my own voice. I did a lot of singing in high school. I did vocal jazz choir in college, and I do not like to hear my own voice. So I'm perfectly happy to fill out a chord or something like that. But yeah, as a performer, it's a wrestling match, and I'd much rather listen to other people do it.
But I mean, being the conductor, especially of a big band like this one, and being the composer, it's almost like you sort of have to be there to transmit the energy.
I guess, yeah. I mean, yeah. Well, now you mention it, sure. I actually cannot see anybody else leading my stuff. I mean, I'm sure somebody could do it, but specifically, the band itself or my music, I think probably plenty of other people could do it. But in that way that J.C. Sanford leads John Hollenbeck's band, and John plays drums. Like, I somehow couldn't imagine myself playing trombone in my own group and somebody else conducting it. So yeah, in that respect, I guess, yeah, I hadn't thought about that. Yeah. Well,
also because your piece is, it's obvious that you love the big band, but also the compositional, the conception, your point of departure is so unique and unusual. And so for somebody else to sort of assimilate that and figure out how to conduct it maybe would be a larger task than normal.
I think there is something where you hear interpretations, and like, I never thought of myself as a classical conductor. I mean, I think I'd just be happy to get through it. And yet I'm aware of the pieces I know well. I would want it to go that way, this needs to be drawn out. This climax needs to be bigger. Somebody needs to bring the horns out more here, and so forth. So, it's obviously people do that in the studio a lot, but when you're live, there's often that sense that, wow, I wish they had done so and so. So yeah, in that respect, I guess I'm uncomfortable being an autocrat or.
But also, I mean, in that regard, your music really falls in an interesting place, between the rigors of composition and spontaneous improvisation, the alchemy that comes with the excitement of live performance. Mm-hmm. And so you as a conductor, I'm sure, I've actually never seen you conduct the band, but I'm sure there's a lot of, moment to moment decision making and kind of frantic arm waving, beyond just, I wish they had done this, but more like, okay, this section, this is how this is going to take shape now, and I'm guiding them through it.
I don't think I have that kind of autonomy in my work, such as, by comparison to the conductions that, like Hugh's doing, and obviously Butch Morris, and, quite a few people, who've been doing them, was Adam Rudolph. That's really, you're shaping every aspect of the piece. You're drawing, you're saying, okay, now it's here, now it's here. Generally, my stuff is written out, pretty much. And there are moments in it where you can stretch the form. There's one place in Pop It where you can go as long as you want, but for the most of the rest of it, it's going to start, and once it's going, you're just kind of standing back and putting beats in the right places.
So where does a piece like Pop It, what's the inception of the idea for a piece like that?
I'm sort of, it's there's a part of me that I feel like I've gotten older and I've matured. I mean, things I didn't appreciate when I was younger, trying to think of a good example. I would say love songs, particularly, that's one for a psychiatrist. But relationships. When I was younger, anybody who knew me from Northern Colorado, if you said, "Could you imagine that person married with kids?" they would have died laughing. I mean, I was not wound tight, but I was neurotic and self-loathing, I suppose. But at some point, I got to appreciate where love songs come from. I can remember actually having, when my daughter was first born, and, trying to come up with songs to sing as lullabies for her. And, there were all these gorgeous tunes like Stardust and, that I don't necessarily, Body and Soul, old standards and stuff, things that I used to have no use for. It's like somebody else can do those. I've got my own ideas of where I want to go and so forth. And I think I learned to appreciate those. So while that has sort of grown, I was sort of thinking, okay, well, so I've mellowed out in some other respects. I think, yes. I mean, I heard just recently, I heard my old senior recital tape from I don't know why, I just came across it and I was listening to it from my senior recital. And anybody who knew me from Northern Colorado knows I had a piece that I worked on for 4 years there called The Rise and Fall of the Black Death. It was about that subtle. And I was listening to it and it was kind of like, the conception of it, I still think of it in an interesting way. Like I had there, because it kept changing. I kept adding in things, of course, and it just got overwrought. But listening to it, I was like, oh, I can't, I mean, it's not something, I still own the score and the parts, but there's no way I would ever put that in front of an audience now. It's just, but that said, the subtlety still is not something that I'm after. I'm sort of, I think particularly, when you see, I mean, I grew up on drum and bugle corps for one thing, which are not subtle things either. But if you watch a drum and bugle corps now, it's a very tasteful, I mean, when they get to the end of the show, they'll sort of pull out all the stops and, you'll get this big wall of sound and they'll get that, that edge on it where, the middle horns are just seriously searing your ears off. But the rest of the show, they kind of keep it under control and so forth. And that's, it's musical. It's wonderfully musical. There's a part of me, though, that remembers back in the 70s where the corps that scored the highest in Hornline were the ones who played the loudest, and so when they first came out, it was like, they would just sear your ears off. And then during the show, they'd be searing your ears off. They'd turn to the back of the field and they'd be blasting to the back of the field and so forth. And I'm not saying that's what I want to do, but I do kind of miss that. I mean, and I think that's something that you heard in a lot of big bands. I think big bands played that way. I think Buddy Rich certainly played that way.
David,
holy cow.
David, this is your way of explaining where the inception of your ideas comes from?
Well, I'm just saying as far as Pop It goes, Pop It is...
Okay, fair enough. Right.
I have a piece called Fenwick, which was one of the first pieces I wrote knowing fully well that I want, what the big band was going to be back in 2003 when I just started really getting time to write big band music. And the name, I chose the name Fenwick because the character Fenwick in the movie Diner by Barry Levinson, played by Kevin Bacon. There's a scene where he does a very stupid practical joke, and he's like dying laughing. I mean, these are guys who are supposed to be ostensibly in like their early 20s or college, post-college age or something. He's just laughing, like he's like, I was waiting weeks to get you guys with this and so forth. And he said, hey, you really got us, Fenwick. And Ellen Barkin's character says, that's very mature, Fenwick. And he says, blank mature. He goes, oh, sorry, and he sort of apologizes. But I said, okay, that's sort of my idea of subtlety here. Like, I'm not in that particular piece. I said, I'm not going to be subtle. And I think other pieces I've been more or less, withdrawn and so forth. But Poppet, there is nothing subtle about Poppet. It's pretty much just straightforward. It's saying, here's what we do. And that's what you're going to get.
So it sounds like a lot of the inceptions of the ideas are images more than musical motives or some sort of strategic thinking. It's more like, you've discovered a feeling from a story or an image that you're going to somehow represent in this piece, and then figuring out how to get to that.
Yes, it depends on the piece, but right. Some of them more so than others.
What would you say about V-Reel?
V-Reel, that started, I can give you, I'll try and do it quickly. That was an idea I had in a bar long before the band, long before I wrote it. I mean, I wrote the piece in 2003. I had the idea in 1987 or 88. I was in a bar in Boston listening to a band, and I don't think it's had anything to do with the band, but I remember thinking, if you could take that huge wall of brass and complexity from Bob Gradinger's City of Glass that Kenton recorded, and I love City of Glass, but it does not swing, and it's not supposed to swing. That's not the point there. But I kept thinking, if you could take that and put a beat under it, similar to Super Stupid by Funkadelic, then it would be amazing. So it's in that respect, it's a simple answer is it's a mashup. And then there's I just started adding a ton of stuff to it. But, I did specify, and some drummers give you more Super Stupid, some give you less of it. But, I think some of those textures are meant to be similar to what Gradinger had with City of Glass.
Wow.
But then there were other things I added to it, probably that just sort of seemed somewhat related to it. There's a cantus firmus in it and so forth. So
let me just play a little bit of that. So that's an excerpt of V-Reel from your new album, A Prayer for Lester Bowie, and with your big band. Super Stupid is a super interesting and unexpected choice. And then you told me that you wrote your dissertation on the music of the 1970s as a PhD candidate at Princeton. And then a lot of things started to make more sense for me, and yet there were a lot more questions that I had about it. And I know Agartha was a big part of that dissertation, and in the extra, we can chat about that piece, the Miles Davis performance, Agartha, which is amazing, from 1975. But how does a piece like Super Stupid play into your Princeton PhD dissertation?
Princeton was, oddly enough, they were open to the stuff that I was doing. Very encouraging. It's funny because everybody had this idea. I think as a department, they changed, to me, seemingly overnight. My first 2 years, it was still kind of, I mean, if you look at the faculty, you wouldn't necessarily have said so, but it still felt like it was the Milton Babbitt 12-tone set theory department. And I mean, certainly the students, there were a lot of people from Juilliard who were still writing, very modernist approaches to music. And I took a year off. And when I came back, all of a sudden, there were a ton of minimalists. And I think the aesthetic of Paul Lansky and Steve Mackey kind of became where the students were going. Specifically, I think with Steve, was a rock and roll guitarist. And I think he kind of encouraged, and I think, Julia Wolf was there at the same time as me. So the Bang on the Can aesthetic, which was embracing rock, and the whole downtown scene, kind of was a real kind of draw for a lot of us. So I think, they were interested in, as far as ideas for a dissertation, one person I talked to said, why are you doing that? You should be, talking about some kind of, serious modernist music. And this wasn't a person who was not, I won't say who was, but he was very much a jazz-oriented person. But my original plan was to talk about 3 pieces on the fringes of jazz. One of them Agartha, one of them Mingus's 3 Worlds of Drums, and one of them City of Glass. And I spent about 2 months trying to figure out how to get the score to City of Glass, wrestling with Werner Herbers and Ebony Band and with North Texas. And I had no money for flying to Texas to do that kind of research. And so I just started on the Agartha part of it. And that spun itself out into, roughly 180 pages of all sorts of stuff that, but then I think also that, Super Stupid, where that goes. I mean, I think that was obviously funkadelic, and, maybe more so Sly and Family Stone and Hendrix were big influences on Miles' work of that period. But I think that idea of the mashup, it's interesting that Miles, and that Miles, also had this big infatuation with Stockhausen from that time, probably via Paul Buckmaster. And that, I think, is kind of what makes that method work for me, is that you've got something really sort of making it more complex than, and I shouldn't use the word complex because that's cheapening what funkadelic does, which is, beyond complex in its own right. But I think somehow if you're talking about Miles and his history, well into his 40s by that point, nearing his 50s, I guess, there's that way, I think, of him in it was to somehow find, and I think specifically, if that piece Rated X on Get Up With It, it has no trumpet in it at all, and which I think is somehow telling of that time. But that's a piece that I think between that and Dark Magus, the album, are 2 that there was that reissue that they put out, I think Bob Belden and some producers put out, where they remixed a lot of that music. And to a person, they were all saying, oh, Dark Magus just sounded so awful and Rated X sounded so awful. I said, I love those. I thought those sounded wonderful. I thought, and again, there was like a searing, sort of high frequency, a lot of the same things that Stockhausen was doing. And I found those are kind of the same things that Miles, was after. And I assumed that was a sound that he wanted. I don't know how Tio Macero felt about it, but right. As far as listeners, Jaw Wobble was a fan. And I think Lester Bangs was a fan, although he, you get with Bangs, it's, you read him one day and he's raving about something the next day. It's the worst thing that anyone ever did.
But this paper about the music of the 70s, you must have, it's a pretty rich period. It's a little bit overlooked. Even within jazz. But when you say the music of the 70s, are you looking more at the popular music, or, because also if you look at so-called classical music, it was a really interesting period.
I think, I teach a class called Music of the 70s, and I think, why be teaching it this year? I can't remember. Holy cow. Like, that's how bad my memory's gotten. But one of the things I always started with, no, I will not be, I have not taught that class actually in a while, but one of the things I started with was that idea that the 70s is kind of that end of an era. In pop music, you look and you go, okay, obviously Hendrix, Beatles, all your wonderful 60s totems break up or they sell out somehow in the 70s. Armstrong dies in 71, Ellington dies in 74, Monk stops playing. You can sort of reel off all the things that kind of get, all these people change direction. Lots of people start, Miles and Ornette start using electronic instruments. And so it's sort of, and then, as far as other controversies, classical music, that's where the rise of the Glass and Reich minimalist comes in, that at least starts to make people think, oh, there's a whole other way forward, even though it's not going to satisfy the people who saw modernism as sort of a singular trajectory. So you get that, but then you also lose Shostakovich, Barber, Britten, so there's kind of the idea of ends of eras. Did I say Stravinsky? I don't remember, but
I don't think you did. But yeah, definitely, that's another big loss.
But so it's kind of a time where, and you also get it, and it's not just here's a new revolution. Like I think all the revolutions of the past, like 12-tone and bebop and free jazz, you can kind of say, okay, there was something there that we can feel good about, at least in theory, at least in idea, what you're trying to do. You can put an ideology behind it and so forth. Whereas in the 70s, you get like Leonard Bernstein's Mass, which I love, and every teacher I had despised, and probably still despises. Most of my friends still despise that. But that's kind of one of those things that when I taught music in the 70s, I always brought up that piece because in that same way of Pippin and Jesus Christ Superstar and Godspell, it's kind of that moment where it's rock and roll invading Broadway, and for better or for worse.
It was the Hamilton of its day.
Yes. So, I do feel, and maybe it's just because I grew up in that era that, I think I'm not sure what your relationship to Maynard Ferguson is. I think he was sort of the most beloved by young people and despised by critics and older people, musicians at that time.
I would say my relationship was fraught, mainly because I was never a high note player. And when I went to music school, there were people who were into Maynard, and the only reason they liked him was because he played really high notes. And I didn't find that particular skill exceptionally interesting. So I totally appreciate the qualities of Maynard and Bill Chase and all these kind of bands that were around. And I heard somebody recreate some Bill Chase a few years ago in the Trumpet Festival, and it was just it was so triumphant. It was so great. I hadn't heard that music in years. So there's definitely qualities to it, but I'm attracted more to a trumpet player like Hugh Reagan and what he did in honoring Lester Bowie on this record, and you chose it as the title of the record, Hugh's Piece.
Just as an aside, you do know, of course, that Hugh played with Maynard for a period.
I didn't know that. No,
he did. He and we've
go wash my mouth out with soap.
Well, it's interesting. He, Bruce Johnstone, we were trying to think, Kenny Wheeler, the people who actually played with both Maynard and with Anthony Braxton. So it's a small number. And Woody Shaw actually does, and so Hugh says. But no, Hugh, oh my gosh. I first heard Hugh, he was a graduate student in Northern Colorado when I started there as a freshman. And I played in the big band that he led. And I don't think I knew that. I think I knew that he had been at Colorado State University before that, and that was about the extent of it. And it was one of those kind of things like, again, you put yourself in that environment where you go to that school. I think if you go to North Texas, then the 1 o'clock band are gods, right in front of you. So in Northern Colorado, Lab 1. I mean, and granted, some of these people are just a year or two ahead of you, but certainly monstrous players there. And at the time, Hugh was, the jazz chair for, that year. And oh my gosh, there was a concert that fall. I think I actually say this in the line notes to the book or to the CD that they played Claire Fisher's in the beginning, big band arrangement of it. And it starts with this trumpet solo by Hugh and it's kind of like, I think I had heard him before that, but it was like maybe at that moment I understood, holy cow. And maybe it's also playing in his band, and sort of getting to know, just how much he knew and, just how much of, what kind of potential he had as far as I could do this, I could do, and I mean, of course, the chops were, formidable, but then just the ideas, it just kind of felt like this could go, what I said about Lester Bowie is like, he could go anywhere. And it was, really in a span of about a good 40, 50 seconds. I said, that is something I want. And, I must have written 2 or 3 pieces ripping that off because I so wanted to do, The Rise and Fall of the Black Death had a beginning that did exactly that. And I wanted you to play it and I couldn't get him to play my senior recital, but it was very life-changing that way. And, it's funny, ever since then, I have a lot of different recordings of him in various different ways and, settings and mediums and so forth. And just fundamentally there, he's always a player who I never get tired of listening to. And but I feel also, that wasn't even necessarily getting the full brunt of what he can do. When you finally sort of heard him in solo settings and so forth. I think we're talking about some of his, records since that time. He has an album as a leader, which I don't know if it's been released on CD, but it was the Metaphysical Question, which I think he's recorded with different sized groups, and it's based on a 12-tone. And we actually performed that. He did a big band version of that with, the group at Northern Colorado. But that, it's on part of an album where it's just a trio. It's him, Thurman Parker on drums, and John Lindberg, I think, on bass. And, the title track, Metaphysical Question, vast majority of a side. I mean, I think it's, about 20 minutes long and it's a lot of Hugh just playing. And it's kind of like he really just stretches out in a way. And I feel like he's, in that same way that we don't get to hear enough of Hugh because he's in Colorado, most of the time. And, when he comes out, he's playing, kind of in collective improv groups. He was playing with Butch Morris and David Murray a lot. And, he would get his moments here and you'd go, wow, it's Hugh Reagan, but it's like, it's great to hear him stretch out that way. So I think, I think we're at a time now where, he's been playing with Art Ensemble and AACM. And I think it's wonderful. I think that we're getting to hear more of him.
Let's play a little bit of this. A Prayer for Lester Bowie. So it's a piece by Hugh Reagan. It's on your record. It's the David Sanford Big Band, which we'll talk about. But I also thought that it was interesting that, Hugh is so skilled at this thing that has become called conduction, creating a piece. Nobody's got music in front of them. They've got a extensive set of rules, hand symbols, and cues, and Hugh is really amazing at it, as you can hear from the recording. Does conduction play a role in your work at all, ever?
I don't think so. I think what I'm bringing as a conductor tends to be, again, what I was saying about Pop It, that, there are a handful of places, depending on the piece. I have one, the first album that we did I have a big band arrangement of Elvin Jones's 3-Card Molly. Then there's a point in there where there's a bunch of background figures. The solos are all sort of open form, except, one point, once you kick in the background, then it's done. The backgrounds go for 32, 48 bars, and then it moves on. But that's about the most that I can sort of bring to those. And that's also a piece where, I have taken advantage of, controlling the volume, or, so, I think there are situations where I can, but I think what I'm doing in those situations is probably not that much different than what, other big band leaders, Kenton, Herman, and so forth did with their groups. So, certainly that way that you're creating right on the moment that Hugh is doing is something that's not really in my arsenal. And I remember thinking that I could do something like Prayer for Lester Bowie without Hugh. I'm not wanting to do it without Hugh. I never really wanted to do it. But I remember thinking I could lead it if necessary. But because I don't think I was really aware that Hugh had become, so proficient as a conductor when I first suggested us doing it. But then Hugh, took it over, and it's he's really a maestro about it.
Did a lot of his language come from Butch Morris? I know that they must have been together for years.
I would think so. I think it was specifically Butch Morris. I think he said that. He worked with Braxton. He worked with Roscoe Mitchell. I think Leo Smith. But specifically, I think it was larger on. I think for a very long time he was working with Morris and David Murray. I saw them in New York back in '92, I think.
Wow. Yeah. Right, and that's about when Butch was really developing the technique of that, and then ultimately stopped playing cornet. But I saw Hugh doing this a little bit, and there were some similar things, but it seems like everybody who takes on conduction ends up growing appendages of their own, sort of new little, right? Little limbs that take hold, and it becomes their own sort of thing, which is in some ways antithetical to what Butch had in mind. Having written in depth about his process and really trying to codify it.
I was surprised, because again, in Northern Colorado, Hugh was kind of doing conduction before, with Metaphysical Question. He had hand signals, and he had things that, again, 4 or 5 different signals to control the piece. But when we started doing Prayer for Lester Bowie, he pulled out a baton, and I think he had been studying conducting. Probably classical conducting. Certainly, I think studying with Butch, or studying Butch's work. But that kind of technique is something I think that he has evolved, or he's, kind of advanced with over the years. So that's really a new refinement of, I would say for the last 5 years that I know of. And he might say something differently, but
well,
yeah, I think he's still growing.
I should call him. He's a PhD now, so I have to call Dr. Reagan.
Yes.
There's a piece on here called Soldier and the CEO, where there's a section in the middle. It feels to me like you get to a similar place to some of the spaces that he brings the band into in his piece. And I know that the process of doing it and the technique of doing it is completely different. In your case, it's clear it's all notated. But but it's a really wonderful. Let me just play a short excerpt of that. Soldier and the CEO, and yeah, it's such a textural moment. It's very beautiful.
Thank you.
And I sort of feel like composition at that level often ends up approaching something that could feel like an improvisation.
That's interesting. I kind of like the idea that, people often, will say that, Ellington played the orchestra, was his instrument and so forth. And, obviously I'm not trying to compare myself to Ellington, but that sense that the orchestration becomes that sort of artistry, and not just, backgrounds and, filling out the changes and, how many kinds, substitutions, can you do, and, altered chords and, all these ideas that, we get so used to in arranging. I think, when you're just really kind of painting it, occasionally you do hear stuff that just, I think, obviously Maria Schneider, when she's on a roll, it's just, feels like it's just spun out. I mean, even though there's certainly, a lot of grit and, in the moment kind of work to it. But yeah, that piece was hard to write. I mean, that's all still, almost all those old ones from 2003 are all written on score, in pencil and so forth. So, I didn't make very many changes with them, even when I feel, some of them I feel are perfect. That one, I've been wrestling with for years, but I think when it's, when the players are on, it's just, I'm perfectly, I love it as it is. So.
Do you feel, I mean, you're in this unique place that is clearly in between what people think of as classical music and what, I avoid using the word jazz. I'll just say improvised music. And, it's a unique space. It's always been a little bit fraught. It's always been a little, I don't want to say controversial, but let's say misunderstood. Mm-hmm. And I just wonder, I mean, obviously, you've put a lot of thought into your work over the years, and you've written these serious dissertations. And I'm sure through the whole career, that meeting place of rigorous notation with spontaneity and improvisation has always been a discussion.
I feel like, I mean, one side of me thinks that if I wrote Mahler 2, I would never need to write improvisation, because I'd be like, I just want to hear that 100,000 times and never listen to anything else. I want to hear it played the exact same way, or, as maybe a conductor's interpretation. That's as far as you want to go off the page with it. But on the other side of it, it's like, when you think of some of the highs that you get from what somebody else does, and, it's something that, I'm aware that, City of Glass doesn't have any improvisation to it. I don't know that I have anything. I had a ballad, and even that one, it opens up into a piano solo at the end. I mean, where there isn't some sort of improvisation, because I just always feel like you need somehow something, to kind of take it into it. And nothing else. I mean, you're sort of aware that, listen, I mean, going back to R&B of the 70s, I mean, the Ohio Players, if you go back and listen to that stuff, it's like, if you listen closely, simple stuff of players in the background throwing in riffs that aren't just the riff, but just something they're making up on the spot. And if you took it out or changed it, it's different and it's lacking something. And it's also that sense when you see a band live and you get that great, whoa, that was awesome. And it's like you're not going to get that back again. And you're lucky if you did get a tape of it because you go, wow, that was perfect. I suppose that's what I sort of wrestle with is when I hear something and I love it that way, I don't want it to change. And, I think specifically like smaller group jazz, it's changing every night. Nobody wants to come out and play something the same way. As a pop singer, I won't name who sings a very famous song of hers, and she sings it way differently than she did 40 years ago, certainly than it is on the album. And my favorite part of it on the album, which is probably how it's written, she doesn't do. And, for whatever reason, I guess, obviously she's tired of it after 40 years. Whereas me, I'm like, that's such the great part of it. So I'm rambling off. I apologize. But I don't know. When I think of certain, probably some of my favorite moments in a lot of these, I have a tendency to put soloists in, kind of at the big moments. And they get a little bit covered up, maybe because I just get so excited about it. Kind of like that idea of the person soloing and, the Greek chorus or the gospel choir, whoever is around them is yelling amen so loud that maybe you don't hear them. And some people despise it. I like to think of it as if you ever saw the movie The Dresser, where, they're doing King Lear and he's like doing the storm scene and, they're like, and the dresser's downstairs saying he wants more noise. They want the storm to be as loud as possible. He wants to have to shriek over it. I don't know that that's something that people, sorry, that's going back to the lack of something.
No. That right there really gets at the crux of the question is like nothing you can write is going to equal that chorus shouting as loud as they possibly can. I want more storm noise.
Yes.
Is like the equivalent of, okay, the page needs to stop here and then I want XYZ to happen. And you, of course, as a composer, you're creating the context in which it all happens. So you're, it's not, no improvisation, I think anyway, is just complete random, unexpected sound. It's all of a piece with who the person is and what the context of the piece is and how you choose as a composer to set it up and create little ground rules, whether spoken or unspoken. Here, this is going to happen and you could do pretty much whatever you want here, but you've got to deal with this and this and this. And then a good improviser is going to take that situation and go, well, thank you, sir. Yes, I will dance this dance and figure it out for you, and then that's how you get those beautiful, exciting results, I think.
I get excited at the idea that a soloist gets into, any surrounding, obviously, like such that, when they walk in, like I'd like to think that, when you go and see, a combo, that person is just chomping at the bit to get out there every night with that piano player, and that bass player. And, that particular configuration just is inspiring in and of itself. So,
Interesting. Well, now you're orchestrating through your band, like you said you weren't going to do.
Did I say it? Okay.
Well, no, you were talking about Ellington and just saying, but what you just described, which I can relate to totally, of the excitement of going to see someone play and being like, wow, those human beings, they're getting up and they have this relationship and they're all really excited to explore what's next in this context. I think that's great. And I think it's really interesting to me that your band, I mean, it's newly named the David Sanford Big Band, which I think is great. Because for the longest time it was called the Pittsburgh Collective, and I never really understood. I mean, I guess I could have asked you, so I'll ask you now, but I think more like than the naming, it's the collective experience of everybody, and the fact that you're here now with this record, and it's a band that's taken shape over a lot of years.
I think so. I think I value counterpoint, and not necessarily, contrapuntal, but yes, contrapuntal. But specifically every voice. I want to hear every voice as much as possible. And it was a pain in the neck as far as mixing this thing. Cause you got 21 tracks, 20 tracks plus, several on the drum set, and you're, wrestling saying, well, I want the drums to be big and present the way they are with Mel Lewis, but then the bass has got to be there all the time. But then you want the piano out there like Roland Hanna, but then you want lead trumpet to sort of ride this. But then it's like, I don't want to leave the trombones out. As a trombonist, I remember, I don't know how many, there are plenty of people that was, well, the trombone is the left hand is what it falls down to. And you're like, well, no, yeah. So I want that kind of, but I kind of want that idea that everybody can hear themselves and that, all those stories are significant in some way. And that's, I think musically speaking, I was trying to think of a piece that really kind of gets, I think All About Rosie by George Russell is one, and it's a smaller band. I think it's only 2 trombones maybe, or 1 trombone, I think, in the original. But you do hear every, you got the guitar that just kind of sings out over it. And, when you can hear everything, to me, I get goosebumps. So it's like, okay, I can go back and listen to this 30 times and hear different parts every time and then hear the relationship between the two. So yeah, I think that's a big part of what I love about big bands.
Wow. Is that why you didn't have your name on it for so many years?
There's a lot of reasons I still feel weird when I'm writing my resume and say, I used to be able to say he's a conductor of the Pittsburgh Collective. It's easy. The big band of Pittsburgh. He's a conductor of the David Sanford. It's kind of like, well, of course he is. It's like, you're the collector.
When I tell people I'm the trumpet player in the Dave Douglas Quintet, it's no surprise, but it's also like gets at a basic truth, I think.
Right. Well, we all know the Dave Douglas Quintet very well, whereas, like if, Bob Smith starts a big band, of course it's the Bob Smith big band. So, yeah, I think even I like the whole Pittsburgh. Maybe I'm hiding behind something. And again, that's probably something for a therapist, but Pittsburgh, to quote a filmmaker who has been canceled, and I probably shouldn't, I won't even imitate him because then we give it away, but I do idolize, I'm paraphrasing because he's not talking about Pittsburgh, but I idolize the city all out of proportion. I lived there till I was 11 and, my favorite amusement park was there. When I lived there, it was the best roller coaster in the world. Obviously, it was the best baseball team in the world in 1971. It was the best football team in the world for 4 out of 6 seasons. And, my father, who lived his entire life there, will tell you it had the most beautiful women in the world. It had the greatest, view of any city from Mount Washington. It had the best view coming out of the tunnel into the city and so forth. And, I believed all of it.
A great jazz lineage.
Yes, my father was like the father in My Big Fat Greek Wedding. He would tell you every jazz musician encyclopedically, Art Blakey, Stanley Turrentine, George Benson. Who?
Mary Lou Williams, right?
Mary Lou Williams, certainly. Nestico, Jim Pugh, Father Hines, the list goes on. And
you quickly ran past the word roller coaster, and I just wanted, in case people don't know, David Sanford is an enormous roller coaster aficionado and geek. And I want to get a link to this thing that you wrote about your roller coaster vacation this summer, where you have in-depth reviews of how many different roller coasters from around the country, like 20.
This trip, I think we only rode because, not to get to whining, but due to ride closures, long lines because of the time of year. I think we only rode about maybe 15 to 20 rides on this trip. But
I see.
Total, my kids and I have ridden about well over 200.
Wow, that's amazing. All right, we'll put that up somewhere, a link to that, and that is just incredible. And it's been great talking to you about the music. I probably have more questions now, so somewhere down the road we'll do this again. But I was going to play Subtraf on the way out and just mention that when we first started talking about this record, you were thinking of calling it Subtraf, I guess, after this piece.
Yes. I feel like the title is an acronym, but I don't think I really don't need to say what it stands for.
Okay. All right.
Bottom line is, though, it's just supposed to be the most sort of Weltschmerz, Adorno post, I want to go here, post-Holocaust level of blues that you can get, which blues tends to not be. Blues tends to always be sort of something that people smile and have a beer and party with now, whereas
it's more like a threnody.
Yes, yeah, but with blues in the background, I think it's kind of a way to try to get to ultimately it's a feature for Mike Christensen, and I just would love to say that Mike Christensen, who was also in Northern Colorado, who was also a featured soloist in the beginning, is when we started the same time at Northern Colorado, and that was kind of one of these things where I played trombone sometimes. When I heard him, I was like, okay, there is a guy who plays trombone seriously, and just his approach to blues, I feel like he's a person who's literally talent deserving wider recognition. So I was very ecstatic to be able to feature him on this. And
that is great. Thank you so much, and it's been great talking. And stick around. We'll talk about Miles Davis, Agartha in the extra. But for everybody listening to this show, you can go pick up A Prayer for Lester Bowie at Greenleaf Music. It's the David Sanford Big Band, and here's the piece, Subtraft. David, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Douglas.
Thank you for listening to this Greenleaf Music Podcast, A Noise from the Deep. Come see us again soon. We do about an episode a month, and you can listen to a lot of them wherever you get your podcasts. The first 30 episodes are available to subscribers at greenleafmusic.com. So please come on over and join us, and we'll talk to you again real soon. Stay safe.